The man who asked God to erase his name. What kind of man asks God to erase his own name from eternity? Not for wealth, not for glory, not even for his own survival, but for others. Tonight, we step into one of the most shocking and intimate moments in biblical history. A moment when a leader stood between judgment and mercy and said, "If you will not forgive them, then remove me too." This is not just a story about Moses. It is a story about love, failure, leadership, justice, mercy, and a hunger to know God that went beyond miracles. And if you stay with me, you may discover that Moses' greatest revelation was not the parting of the sea, but the longing of his own heart. A man on the mountain. When we think of Moses, we picture the epic scenes. A baby in a basket floating down the Nile. A burning bush that does not burn. A staff raised over the Red Sea as water split in two. Thunder rolling across Mount Sinai as commandments are written in stone. Moses stands like a giant in the Old Testament story. Prophet, lawgiver, liberator, shepherd of a restless nation. But behind the dramatic miracles is something deeper, something quieter, a relationship. And sometimes that relationship was strained by the failures of the very people he was called to lead. Imagine this. Moses is standing at the top of Mount Sinai. The mountain trembles. Clouds swirl. Lightning flashes. The presence of God descends in fire and glory. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses remains there alone with the Almighty. Below him, however, something very different is happening. The people grow restless. They cannot see Moses. They cannot see God. And when human beings cannot see, they often create something they can. Gold earrings are melted. Fire roars. A shape emerges. A calf. A glittering idol. And the people declare, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." At the very moment Moses is receiving the command, "You shall have no other gods before me," the first commandment is already being shattered below. When God tells Moses what has happened, the words are sharp. The betrayal is immediate. The covenant has barely begun, and already it is broken. Moses descends a mountain carrying the stone tablets. As he sees the celebration, the dancing, the idolatry, his anger burns. He throws the tablets down. They shatter at the foot of the mountain. But that is not the moment that shocks us. The shocking moment comes after. Moses returns to God, and instead of asking for personal protection, instead of defending his own leadership, he says, "These people have committed a great sin, but now please forgive them. And if not, blot me out of the book you have written. Blot me out. Erase me. Take my name instead." Pause there. This is not symbolic language. This is a man offering himself. Why? Why would Moses make such a desperate plea? To understand that, we must step deeper into who Moses really was and what he had learned about God. And that is where our journey truly begins. The weight of leadership. Leadership is not about standing in front of a crowd when things go well. It is about standing between the crowd and disaster when things fall apart. Moses had seen miracles. He had confronted Pharaoh. He had watched plagues devastate Egypt. He had stretched out his staff and seen the sea divide. But leading people is harder than splitting oceans. The Israelites complained about food, about water, about direction, about discomfort. Freedom had come, but freedom without trust turns into chaos. When they worshiped the golden calf, it was more than just disobedience. It was a rejection of relationship. They preferred something visible, something controllable. Moses could have said, "They chose this. Let them face the consequences." Instead, he identified with them. True intercession always carries identification. Moses stood before God not as a superior, but as a representative. And yet, God's response is clear. Each person is responsible for their own sin. Here we see something profound. Mercy does not erase justice, and justice does not cancel mercy. Both exist together. Moses begins to understand something deeper. He cannot ultimately save these people. He can plead, he can pray, but he cannot replace them. That longing to stand in the gap points forward to a greater mediator yet to come. But Moses does not know that yet. He is still learning. And sometimes his lessons are severe when obedience becomes personal. Before Moses ever returned to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, there was a strange and unsettling episode recorded in Scripture. On the journey back, Something happens, something so serious that God is ready to strike him down. Why? Because Moses had neglected a covenant responsibility within his own household. The man chosen to represent God publicly had failed to obey God privately. Leadership without personal obedience is hollow. It is easy to preach principles. It is harder to live them when no one is watching. That night on the journey was a wake-up call. Moses would not be allowed to represent a holy God casually. If he was to lead, he must first submit, and that pattern continues throughout his life. The higher the calling, the deeper the accountability. The rock in the wilderness. Years later, another moment of failure would cost him dearly. The people were thirsty again. They complained again. Their words cut like knives. God instructed Moses to speak to a rock, and water would flow. Instead, in frustration, Moses struck the rock, not once but twice. Water still came. The miracle still happened, but obedience had been compromised. It seemed small. After all Moses had endured, was this really so serious? Yet God declared that because of this, Moses would not enter the promised land. At first, it feels harsh. But consider this. Moses was not merely providing water. He was representing God before the people. Anger distorted the picture. Sometimes consequences are not about the size of the action, but about the clarity of the message. The man who had spoken face-to-face with God could not afford to misrepresent him, and so Moses would lead the people to the edge of the promise, but not step inside. Imagine that weight. To spend 40 years guiding others toward a destination you yourself will never enter. What kind of faith continues walking under that sentence? The faith of a man who desires God more than geography. The man who saw glory. If Moses had only been a miracle worker, his story would have ended in frustration. But Moses wanted something more. After the golden calf incident, after interceding, after seeing judgment and mercy intertwine, Moses makes an extraordinary request. Show me your glory. He had seen plagues, fire, thunder, clouds, wonders, but those were displays of power. He wanted presence. God responds with tenderness and caution. No one can see his face and live, yet he offers a glimpse. Moses is placed in a cleft of the rock. God passes by. The divine name is proclaimed, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Notice this. When Moses asks to see glory, God reveals character, not lightning, not earthquakes. Character. Glory is not just brightness. It is goodness. And when Moses descends a mountain, his face shines. Not because he demanded spectacle, but because he encountered holiness. The greatest revelation in Moses' life was not the Red Sea. It was knowing who God is. The hidden grave. When Moses' life comes to an end, he climbs Mount Nebo at 120 years old. He sees the land from afar. Hills, valleys, promise. And then he dies. Scripture tells us something astonishing. God himself buries him. No shrine, no marked tomb. No monument for pilgrims. Why? Because even a good leader can become an idol. The people had already turned a bronze serpent, once used for healing, into an object of worship. How much more might they have worshipped the grave of Moses? Sometimes love hides what we would misuse. Moses disappears quietly from history, but not from God's story. Because centuries later, something breathtaking happens. A mountain again. Another mountain. Another moment of glory. This time, Jesus stands radiant before 3 disciples. His face shines. His garments gleam with light. And suddenly, 2 figures appear. One representing the law. One representing the prophets. Moses stands there. The man who once asked to see glory now stands within it. The man who could not enter the earthly promised land appears in heavenly splendor. His life was not defined by what he was denied, but by whom he knew. And when the disciples look up, they see only Jesus. That is the final lesson. Moses points beyond himself. Every law he carried, every miracle he performed, every intercession he offered, all of it whispered of someone greater. Closing reflection. So, what do we learn from the man who asked to have his name erased? We learn that leadership is sacrifice, that obedience matters, that anger has consequences, that miracles are not the highest revelation, that even good things can become idols, that glory is found in knowing God's character. And most of all, we learn that the deepest cry of the human heart is not for power, but for presence. Moses began as a reluctant shepherd. He became a liberator. He stumbled. He interceded. He pleaded. He shone. And in the end, the greatest revelation of his life was this: to know God is greater than to see the sea divided. To walk with God is greater than to enter any earthly promise. And to hunger for his glory is to mark a heart that truly lives. So, tonight, perhaps the question is not whether we would part waters or climb mountains. The question is simpler. Do we hunger to know him as Moses did? Because that hunger is where revelation begins. As the echo of the opening scene still lingers in our hearts, the whisper wind over ancient hills, the distant cry of a shepherd's call, and the quiet tension between promise and uncertainty, we now step deeper into the unfolding story. What began as a question in the silence slowly becomes a revelation written across generations. Because in Scripture, nothing happens in isolation. Every promise is born in a moment of impossibility. Every calling is wrapped in doubt before it is clothed in faith. And so we continue. The land was dry, not just dry in the sense of cracked earth and thirsty crops, but dry with waiting, waiting for rain, waiting for change, waiting for God to speak again. Years had passed since the promise was first spoken. Years since Abraham had looked up at a sky filled with stars and heard the voice of the Lord say that his descendants would be as countless as those lights scattered across the darkness. At first, the promise felt near enough to touch. But as time moved forward and Sarah's hair grew silver, the promise began to feel like a distant memory. Have you ever held on to something God told you, only to watch the calendar turn without seeing it fulfilled? That is where we find Abraham now. He is older, slower, quieter perhaps, but not empty, because faith does not always shout. Sometimes it simply breathes. And in the stillness of one ordinary day, God speaks again, not with thunder this time, not with fire from heaven, but with a visitation so personal that it almost feels domestic. 3 visitors approach Abraham's tent by the oaks of Mamre. Dust clings to their sandals. The sun presses down heavily. Yet Abraham runs to greet them. There is something in their presence, something sacred. Hospitality flows from Abraham instinctively. Water for their feet, bread from Sarah's hands. A tender calf prepared quickly. It is a scene of generosity, humility, and urgency. Abraham does not yet fully understand who stand before him, but his spirit knows this moment matters. And then comes a sentence that shakes the air. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" The question pierces deeper than it sounds. It is not about location. It is about destiny. Sarah is inside the tent listening when the promise is repeated. "By this time next year, she shall have a son." She laughs. Not the laughter of joy, the laughter of disbelief, the laughter of someone who has rehearsed disappointment too many times. And who could blame her? Her body has aged beyond childbearing. Her hope has learned to live cautiously. Dreams deferred have a way of teaching us not to expect too much. But then comes a response from the Lord. Is anything too hard for the Lord? That question echoes across centuries, across deserts, across hospital rooms and broken marriages and unanswered prayers. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah denies her laughter at first, fear rising quickly. But God does not rebuke her harshly. He simply answers gently, firmly. "No, but you did laugh." It is not condemnation. It is invitation. An invitation to believe again. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because before the child of promise is born, there's another conversation that must take place. One that reveals the heart of Abraham in a way few moments do. The visitors rise to leave. They look towards Sodom. And suddenly, the narrative slows. God speaks almost as if thinking aloud. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? It is astonishing. The creator of heaven and earth choosing to reveal his plans to a man. Why? Because relationship changes everything. God does not simply use Abraham. He walks with him. He trusts him with knowledge. And what Abraham hears next is devastating. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah has grown great. Their sin has reached heaven. Judgment is coming. But instead of stepping back in silence, Abraham steps forward. And here we witness one of the most powerful acts of intercession in Scripture. Abraham draws near. Notice that phrase. He draws near, not in arrogance, not in defiance, but in bold humility. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He asks. It is a dangerous question, a courageous one. He begins to plead, not for himself, but for others, for a city steeped in corruption, for people who do not know they are about to face destruction, for his nephew Lot, living within its walls. 50 righteous, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Each time, Abraham lowers a number. Each time, God responds with patience. There is something deeply revealing here. God is not eager to destroy. He is willing to spare for the sake of the few. And Abraham stands in the gap. Have you ever prayed for someone who didn't deserve it? Have you ever asked God for mercy on behalf of someone who may never thank you? This is what intercession looks like. It is uncomfortable, risky, bold, and it reflects the very heart of God. Eventually, the conversation ends. 10 righteous people cannot be found. The visitors continue towards Sodom, and the tone of the story darkens. Lot sits at the city gate, a position of influence. When he sees the 2 angels arrive, he rises to greet them urgently, echoing Abraham's earlier hospitality. There is familiarity here, but also tension. The city is not like Abraham's tent. Night falls quickly. The men of Sodom surround Lot's house, demanding the visitors be brought out. The corruption is not hidden. It is public, aggressive, brazen. Lot pleads with them. He tries to protect his guests. His choices are complicated. His compromise is visible. And in the chaos, the angels intervene, blinding the mob, urging Lot to gather his family. Escape for your life, they say. Do not look back. It is a command both physical and spiritual. Leave the corruption. Leave the attachments. Leave the compromise. At dawn, judgment falls. Fire and sulfur rain from the heavens. Smoke rises like a furnace. And Lot's wife, hesitating, longing, glancing backward, becomes a pillar of salt. It is one of the most haunting images in Scripture. Why look back? Perhaps because even when God rescues us, part of us still mourns what we leave behind. The destruction of Sodom is not merely a story of wrath. It is a warning about gradual compromise, a reminder that proximity to corruption reshapes the soul over time. Meanwhile, Abraham stands at a distance the next morning. He looks toward the cities and sees the smoke rising. There is silence. The intercession is over, the judgment complete, but the promise still alive. Because even in the midst of destruction, God remembers his covenant. Lot is rescued because of Abraham's plea, and time moves forward. Soon after, in a moment that feels almost quiet compared to the drama before it, the impossible finally happens. Sarah conceives. Laughter returns, but this time it is different. Not the laughter of disbelief, the laughter of fulfillment. She holds her son and says, God has made laughter for me. Isaac, his name means he laughs. Every time she calls him, she remembers the day she doubted, and the day God proved faithful anyway. And here, the story could feel complete. Promise given, promise fulfilled. But faith is rarely a straight line, because the same God who gave the promise will now test the heart of the one who received it. Years pass. Isaac grows. And then comes a command that shakes the foundations of everything Abraham thought he understood. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him. No explanation, no reasoning, just obedience demanded. Can you imagine the weight of that walk? 3 days' journey to Mount Moriah, 3 days of silence, 3 days of wrestling thoughts. Isaac carries the wood on his back. Abraham carries the knife and the fire. Father, Isaac says, we have the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb? And Abraham answers with words that echo beyond that mountain. God will provide. He does not yet know how, but he trusts who. At the summit, the altar is built, the wood arranged, the sun bound, the knife lifted, and at the final second, a voice from heaven stops him. Do not lay a hand on the boy. A ram caught in a thicket. Provision. The place is named. The Lord will provide. This moment is not about cruelty. It is about revelation. Abraham learns that God is not like the false gods of surrounding nations who demand child sacrifice. The test reveals trust, not loss. And centuries later, on a hill not far from Moriah, another father would offer another son. But that is a story still unfolding. For now, Abraham descends a mountain changed. He has seen God as promise keeper, as judge, as provider, and through it all, one thread remains constant. Faith grows in the tension between what we see and what God has spoken. As we move toward the closing reflections of this story, we must pause and ask ourselves, where are we standing? At the tent of waiting? At the gates of compromise? On the mountain of testing? Because the same God who walked with Abraham still calls, still promises, still provides. And what happens next will not only reveal the destiny of one family, it will point forward to a redemption far greater than Abraham could have imagined. As Abraham descended Mount Moriah, the wind no longer felt the same. The mountain that had witnessed trembling obedience now stood silent behind him. The altar remained. The ashes remained. The memory remained. But Abraham did not descend as the same man who had climbed. He had walked up carrying a promise. He walked down carrying a revelation. And that revelation would echo far beyond his lifetime. Because what happened on that mountain was never only about Abraham. It was never only about Isaac. It was about the unfolding heart of God. A heart that provides, a heart that tests, a heart that rescues, and a heart that ultimately gives. The story does not end at the ram in the thicket. It widens. The quiet years that shaped destiny. After Mount Moriah, Scripture grows quieter about Abraham. There are no more dramatic mountains, no more recorded negotiations with God, no fire falling from heaven, just life. And sometimes, that is where the greatest transformation happens. Isaac grows into manhood. The laughter that once filled Sarah's tent becomes a steady rhythm of generational continuity. The boy who carried wood on his back becomes the heir of covenant promise. But before the next chapter unfolds, there is loss. Sarah dies. The woman who once laughed in disbelief now rests in the earth of Canaan, the very land God promised. Abraham mourns deeply. The grief is real. Faith does not cancel sorrow. And yet, even in mourning, Abraham does something remarkable. He purchases a burial cave in the land, not as a visitor, not as a temporary traveler, but as someone claiming inheritance. The cave of Machpelah becomes more than a tomb. It becomes a declaration. God's promise continues beyond death. Faith, at its deepest level, believes beyond what the eyes can see. Have you ever had to hold on to a promise while standing in a place of grief? Abraham did, and he did so without spectacle, without applause, simply with steady trust. The next generation begins. As Abraham ages, his attention shifts toward Isaac's future. The covenant must continue, but not through just any union. He sends a servant back toward his homeland to find a wife for Isaac. And here, quietly, another story of providence unfolds. A well, a prayer, a woman named Rebekah drawing water. It is no accident. God does not abandon his promises between dramatic moments. He works through ordinary decisions, ordinary journeys, ordinary kindness. Rebekah agrees to leave her family, to travel toward a man she has never met, to step into a story already written by divine intention. When she sees Isaac in the field at evening, meditating, the meeting feels almost poetic. Two lives aligned by unseen hands. And the scripture tells us something tender. Isaac loved her. After the trauma of Moriah, after the death of Sarah, love enters again. Healing often follows obedience. The covenant moves forward. Abraham's final breath. Eventually, Abraham's long journey reaches its earthly end. The man who once wandered without a map. The man who left everything familiar. The man who argued with God. The man who nearly sacrificed his son. He dies old and full of years. But here is what is striking. He never saw the full fulfillment of the promise. He did not see a nation as countless as the stars. He did not see kings rise from his lineage. He did not see the Messiah. He saw only the beginning. And that is the nature of faith. Faith plants trees under whose shade it may never sit. Abraham is buried in the cave he purchased, alongside Sarah. and Isaac and Ishmael stand together to bury their father. Even fractured relationships find moments of peace in the presence of legacy. The echo across generations. The covenant continues through Isaac, through Jacob, through 12 sons, through slavery in Egypt, through deliverance under Moses, through wilderness wanderings, through kings like David, through prophets who cry out in warning and hope. The promise given under a starlit sky expands like ripples in water, and centuries later, another father would walk another hill, not Mount Moriah this time, though not far from it, on a hill called Golgotha, where no ram would replace the son, where provision would come through sacrifice. When Abraham said, "God will provide," he spoke more truth than he understood. The test on Moriah was a shadow. The cross would be the substance. The obedience of Abraham foreshadowed a greater obedience. The near sacrifice of Isaac pointed forward to a sacrifice that would not be stopped. This is why the story matters. Not because it is ancient, but because it is connected. The God who tested Abraham is the God who gave himself. The God who provided a ram is the God who became the lamb. Where does this leave us? So now we return to the question we asked earlier. Where are you standing? At the tent of waiting? At the gates of compromise? On the mountain of testing? Or perhaps in the quiet years in between, where nothing dramatic seems to happen, but faith is being shaped invisibly? The story of Abraham teaches us something essential. Faith is not perfection. Abraham doubted. Sarah laughed. Lot compromised. Isaac questioned. And yet, God remained faithful. This is not a story about flawless people. It is a story about a faithful God, a God who invites conversation, a God who listens to intercession, a God who rescues from destruction, a God who keeps promises across generations, a God who provides at the last second, and sometimes a God who asks us to trust before we understand. The unfinished story. Here is the most beautiful truth. The story is not over, because the covenant that began with Abraham did not end in Genesis. It expands into the New Testament, into the early church, into the spread of the gospel across nations, into history, into today. The same question asked in Sarah's tent still whispers into our lives. Is anything too hard for the Lord? The same declaration spoken on Moriah still echoes. The Lord will provide. And the same invitation given to Abraham still stands before us. Walk by faith, not because the path is clear, but because the one who calls is faithful. Perhaps your promise feels delayed. Perhaps your mountain feels too steep. Perhaps you are standing in the smoke of something that has just collapsed. Remember this. God's faithfulness is not measured by speed. It is measured by certainty. He finishes what he begins. The stars Abraham once counted still fill the sky. And somewhere in ways unseen, you may be part of that promise unfolding. Because faith is not about seeing the entire picture. It is about taking the next step and trusting that beyond the mountain, provision waits.